then like 75% of Americans would now vote for a gay person. That's a big change from 10 years ago.
Yep.
60% would vote for a Muslim. 58% would vote for an atheist. Socialist, 47. It's at the very bottom of the ballot. They hear socialist, they think herpes, Bernie.
Under Trump, the Congress voted for $1 trillion in tax breaks for the richest people in this country and the largest corporations. That's a giveaway. We just increased military spending with very little discussion, I don't know if you know this, by $80 billion. Military industrial complex.
Including the Democrats.
Pardon me?
The Democrats vote for it too.
Yes, absolutely correct.
Bill Maher delivered a sharp and aggressive on-air rant where he directly took aim at Bernie Sanders with a forceful and unfiltered takedown during a live television broadcast that quickly escalated into one of the most talked-about moments of the show.
When he ran in 2020, Bernie Sanders said he would legalize marijuana on his first day as president, but that the business of selling pot would be awarded first to those who suffered most from the drug war. And you know what? I can't argue with that instinct. The drug war has been a horrendous instrument of prejudice and punishment for racial minorities, so it seems fair that they jumped the line for weed franchises the way Indians did for casino. But it's also what's holding up Republican support for legalizing weed nationally, which would be good for everybody. And these are the hard, practical choices the Democrats have to weigh. Redress the past, or reach out to the gettable white voter who says, you know what, I'd like a shot at getting in the pot business.
Bernie Sanders has been dominating the news cycle recently with his strong push for a socialist-style agenda, and Bill Maher is clearly not holding back in response. The criticism is sharp, direct, and aimed straight at the core of Sanders' political platform. It comes across as relentless and focused, leaving little room for soft interpretation. This is the kind of exchange that pulls attention fast and sets social media buzzing as viewers react to every word.
Bernie Sanders, his big thing was always bringing single-payer health care to our country of 340 million. But when liberal, tie-dyed Vermont tried to do it for a population of 626,000, it collapsed like that poor in the Oval Office last week. Bernie, AOC, Mandani are not Democrats. They'll be the first to tell you that. They're democratic socialists, and that's a very different thing, and I don't think people know that.
Here Bill Maher is not focusing on Bernie Sanders simply talking about marijuana legalization in the event he reaches the White House, but instead he is targeting the broader strategy behind it, and the way it is being framed. Sanders' reported approach to give priority to Latinos for early access into cannabis business ownership has sparked strong criticism, especially from Republican voices who call it risky and politically driven. Critics argue that it could create unintended consequences and even strengthen already existing illegal markets. Regardless of whether that claim holds up or not, Maher's response goes in a different direction. He is mocking what he sees as identity-first policymaking taking over practical decision-making instead of supporting a controversial rollout. He argues for a more neutral system that avoids racial preference entirely and focuses on fairness and competence rather than selecting groups based on identity.
Move toward a Medicare for all single-payer program, which guarantees health care to all people. It would cost a lot of money. That's true. But what they forget to tell you is it would be much more cost-effective than the dysfunctional system we have right now, which is the most expensive per capita on earth.
But it couldn't even work in your home state of Vermont. They were going to institute it, and the governor said, it's going to cost too much money. We just can't do it. It would be the entire budget.
No, well...
That's true.
Well, I'm not the governor of the state of Vermont. I'm the senator from the state of Vermont.
Bill Maher then shifts his focus to Bernie Sanders' push for a single-payer healthcare system and does not hold back in his criticism. He takes a sharp, skeptical tone, questioning the practicality of the proposal and pointing to its troubled history in Vermont, a state often seen as politically aligned with progressive reform. Even in what should have been a favorable testing ground with a smaller population and supportive leadership, the plan ultimately ran into serious financial pressures and structural challenges. For Maher, that outcome is not just a minor setback but a central warning sign. He uses it to argue that if a policy struggles to survive in a controlled and relatively cooperative environment, it raises serious doubts about how it could function on a national scale across a country as large and complex as the United States. The point he drives home is that while sweeping socialist-style policies can sound appealing in theory, they often face major obstacles when confronted with real-world implementation and economic realities.
Then the question is, Bill, you tell me, why is it that every other major country on earth,
I will
every
tell you why. Because they control both ends of it. If you're saying that the government is going to pick up the tab, but not make the insurance companies, the hospitals, and the doctors not gouge people,
right,
then we are going to break the budget. It has to work both ways.
Exactly.
And, okay, so then
but here's an example.
So you're going to make the hospitals do that? You're going to because that is
the United
socialist.
States is the only major country on earth that allows private insurance companies to make huge profits in the healthcare system.
Right.
The function of healthcare should be to provide quality care to all people, not to make huge profits of the drug companies and insurance companies.
This is where critics say the argument starts to carry a layer of irony. Vermont, a small progressive state and effectively part of Bernie Sanders' political base, once explored a single-payer healthcare system but ultimately abandoned it after concluding the costs would be significantly higher than its existing framework. For skeptics, that episode remains a lingering contradiction in the debate. They question how a model that struggled in a relatively small, politically aligned state with a modest population could realistically be scaled to fit the entire United States. That question keeps resurfacing in the broader discussion. Sanders continues to present single-payer healthcare as a long-term cost-saving reform, but opponents point back to Vermont as evidence that the financial assumptions may not hold up in practice. To them, it is more than theory on paper. It is a real-world example that fuels ongoing doubts about whether large-scale systemic reforms can actually deliver the results they promise.
Are radicals about this concept, and radical economic policy is always ineluctably married to radical social policy. Their platform, for example, calls for completely open borders. They're for what Biden was doing, but more. You think you're going to win an election on that? This just seems like more extremism at a time when Americans are begging both parties, please, could just one of you act normal?
That is one of the hardest questions surrounding any free or single-payer healthcare model, because even if the government guarantees coverage, it does not automatically eliminate the incentive for private hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, and other providers to maximize profits within the system. Critics argue that without strict cost controls and strong enforcement, providers could inflate prices, overbill services, or encourage unnecessary treatments, which could drive overall costs far beyond initial projections. In that scenario, what begins as an effort to reduce the financial burden on citizens could gradually turn into a more bloated and inefficient system that ends up costing more than the current one. Governments would then be forced into difficult decisions such as raising taxes, cutting services, or tightening regulations in ways that might affect access or quality of care. The concern is ultimately about incentives, and whether a system designed to make healthcare more affordable could unintentionally create conditions that make it even more expensive for taxpayers in the long run.
Defund the police or military in the streets. Either MAGA's crypto crony capitalism or city-run grocery stores. No, I don't want that. I want a Democrat who reassures me if you like your Whole Foods, you can keep your Whole Foods. Governor-elect Spanberger once said about Biden's presidency that, quote, nobody elected him to be FDR. They elected him to be normal. Normal! You know, at this year's DSA convention, or as it's commonly known, Comic-Con, get this, you had to submit a photo of a negative COVID test to get in. In 2025. Yeah, no one wants to do that again.
Bill Maher then moves to what he characterizes as Bernie Sanders' more permissive stance on immigration, focusing on what he sees as a looser and less structured approach. He raises concerns that are already widely debated in public discourse, pointing to perceived gaps in enforcement and oversight. Critics in this line of argument often cite examples such as asylum claims with limited documentation being used to gain entry, visa overstays that go untracked, and sanctuary policies that may limit cooperation with deportation efforts even after minor offenses. However, Maher's central point is not framed as opposition to immigration itself, but rather as a question of structure, consistency, and control. In his view, any functioning system requires clear rules, reliable enforcement, and a framework that treats both citizens and legal entrants fairly. Without that balance, he argues, the system risks becoming increasingly difficult to manage and could ultimately weaken public trust in the process rather than reinforce it.
I don't think most Americans realize they're already socialists.
In certain respects, okay. We want to deal with the grotesque level of income and wealth inequality in America. Very few people think it is acceptable or moral that the top 1/10 of 1% owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. That we have seen a proliferate.
But see, Bernie, you always say that, and I think even the Republicans are not for income inequality. They hear that, but it doesn't compute that that's going to be solved by socialism. Socialism is the programs they already like. They like Social Security. That's socialism.
But
they like Medicare. They like the VA. They like the military.
No, that's exactly right.
It's already a socialist country.
Bill Maher argues that Bernie Sanders' embrace of what he describes as more extreme woke ideals is a key factor that repeatedly creates political friction for him on the national stage. In Maher's view, Sanders does not only face opposition from Republicans, but also skepticism from within his own party, where some Democrats see his platform as too ideologically rigid and politically risky to win a general election. He points to Sanders' socialist-leaning policies as a major sticking point, suggesting they often fail to connect with a broader segment of voters who may lean left but still prefer more moderate, practical solutions. Even among Democratic voters, Maher claims there is growing fatigue with messaging that feels more ideological than grounded in everyday concerns. The result, he argues, is a candidate who can energize a loyal base but struggles to expand beyond it, raising questions about his ability to unify the party and compete effectively on a national level.
You won't be getting their vote. Then like 75% of Americans would now vote for a gay person. That's a big change from 10 years ago.
Yep.
60% would vote for a Muslim. 58% would vote for an atheist. Socialist, 47. It's at the very bottom of the ballot. They hear socialist, they think herpes, Bernie.
Maher's argument lands on a familiar point. The United States already operates with a broad mix of social safety nets without fully shifting into a centralized socialist system. Programs like SNAP, Medicaid, Social Security, and the VA already provide food assistance, healthcare coverage, retirement income, and disability support to millions of Americans, forming a layered system of targeted aid rather than a fully state-run economy. His broader claim is that strengthening or expanding these existing programs is fundamentally different from restructuring the entire economy around a comprehensive socialist model. Critics of large-scale socialism often point to examples like Venezuela and North Korea as warnings, arguing that extensive state control can lead to economic inefficiency, shortages, and reduced individual opportunity. The takeaway, in Maher's framing, is to build on systems that already function, fix their flaws where necessary, but avoid betting everything on sweeping structural overhauls that could introduce greater instability than they solve.
American people believe that the largest corporations and the wealthiest people who today are doing phenomenally well while the middle class shrinks, do people believe they should be asked to pay more in taxes? The American people say yes.
Okay. But now this has been studied. The amount of tax revenue that we would get just from taxing the people who I think your fans think you're talking about, the people who own a yacht, does not come close to covering what you want to pay for.
Many Americans remain skeptical of socialism for one central reason. They question how well it actually works in practice. On paper, it offers an appealing vision of fairness and equality, with the promise that everyone's basic needs will be covered. However, critics argue that real-world outcomes often look very different. When governments take tighter control of industries, they say inefficiencies can increase, innovation may slow down, and incentives to work, invest, or compete can weaken over time, potentially leading to lower growth, fewer job opportunities, and reduced productivity. Another concern is control over distribution itself, where goods and services that are meant to be freely provided can end up being managed through strict bureaucratic systems that determine availability, quantity, and timing. In that view, central planning can result in shortages, long delays, and limited choice. For many Americans, the concern is not about rejecting public support, but about avoiding a system they believe could trade economic freedom and opportunity for heavy control and uncertainty.
Under Trump, the Congress voted for $1 trillion in tax breaks for the richest people in this country and the largest corporations. That's a giveaway. We just increased military spending with very little discussion, I don't know if you know this, by $80 billion. Military industrial complex.
Including the Democrats.
Pardon me?
The Democrats vote for it too.
Yes, absolutely correct. Absolutely right.
And that, critics argue, is really the heart of the matter. Simply calling for higher taxes on the wealthy does not automatically resolve deeper structural economic problems. They say the core issue is not only how much revenue is collected, but how effectively that money is managed and spent once it enters the system. Billions of taxpayer dollars already move through federal and state budgets each year, yet concerns about waste, inefficiency, and mismanagement continue to surface. Projects like California's high-speed rail, often criticized for major cost overruns and delays, or Boston's Big Dig, which famously went far beyond its original budget and timeline, are frequently cited as cautionary examples. Even at the federal level, reports of improper payments and financial errors suggest significant losses within large programs every year. From this perspective, the argument is straightforward. Before asking citizens to contribute more, governments should demonstrate stronger accountability and the ability to convert existing funding into clear, measurable results. At the core of these debates is the tension between practicality and ideology. Critics like Bill Maher argue that ambitious socialist-leaning proposals, from open borders to single-payer healthcare, may sound compelling in theory but often run into real-world complications when applied at scale. They point to examples such as Vermont's abandoned healthcare initiative, large government projects with major cost overruns, and concerns about system abuse as evidence of the risks of overreach. At the same time, Americans generally support social safety nets, but also expect accountability, efficiency, and measurable outcomes in return. From this perspective, the focus should be less on sweeping ideological transformation and more on improving existing systems, managing public resources responsibly, and implementing policies that strengthen the country without creating unintended economic or social consequences.